At the age of 67, Bruce Campbell stands in front of the crowd like an icon that many generations of audiences have grown up with. An unmistakable face of American cult cinema, the man who left a deep imprint with the role of Ash Williams in The Evil Dead, the low-budget horror film that later became a cultural monument, spawning an entire franchise that stretched through Evil Dead 2 and Army of Darkness. He is not only an actor, but also a producer, director, and author of the famous memoir If Chins Could Kill, a work highly regarded in the film-loving community. His career has spanned hundreds of projects, from film to television, highlighted by the role of Sam Axe in Burn Notice, which helped him reach a wider mainstream audience. He frequently appears at fan conventions, honored as a living legend of the B-movie genre, a person with profound influence on the independent filmmaking generation. Without needing an Oscar or billion-dollar blockbusters, Bruce Campbell has still built a distinct legacy where his name is tied to creativity, personality, and the ability to turn small projects into cultural phenomena. He is seen as one of the faces representing the underdog spirit of Hollywood, a person who never topped the charts but always remains in the memory of audiences, a proof that influence is not only measured by box office revenue, but also by the mark left in viewers' hearts. But behind all of that is another story that few people truly see. A long journey of missed opportunities, years trapped in a role he could not escape, and a career that always stood right on the border between being remembered and being forgotten. Bruce Campbell paid the price with his own body during the grueling shooting days of Evil Dead, enduring injuries, exhaustion, and conditions that many other actors would refuse. But in return, he did not receive commensurate recognition from the Hollywood system. He watched others rise to A-list stardom, while he remained labeled a B-movie actor, a title that was both a source of pride and an invisible limitation. His first marriage fell apart during a period of career instability, long years of non-stop work that brought no breakthrough, all accumulating into a quiet pain that he chose to hide behind humor. And yet, he has never abandoned the path he chose, still continuing to appear, continuing to contribute, continuing to make audiences laugh, as if every time he steps on stage is an affirmation that he is still here, still exists, and will not disappear, even when the spotlight has never truly shone directly on him. Before stepping into the journey behind that smile, please hit subscribe and leave a heart. That is how you acknowledge a man who has dedicated his entire life but has never been fully recognized. Bruce Campbell was born in Michigan into a middle-class family, not in poverty, not lacking, but also without a clear path laid out ahead. It was the kind of childhood where everything was enough to survive, but not enough to shape a solid dream, where a child grew up amid days so ordinary they were almost invisible, with no major events to remember, but also no one who truly saw who he was becoming. His father, who worked in local television, unintentionally became the first door that opened to the world of performance, introducing Bruce to cameras, lights, and stories created in front of the lens, but that did not come as a clear direction, but rather like a brief glimpse into another world, a place that seemed more vibrant than the ordinary life he was living. In such an environment, Bruce did not learn to become the center. He learned to exist by making others pay attention to him, often through humor, jokes, exaggerated expressions, small ways to ensure he did not fade into the background of the room. It was not innate confidence, but a reflex, a way to be seen in a world that did not automatically look his way. And then, during those years, he met Sam Raimi, an encounter that would later shape his entire life. But at that time, it was simply two boys with imaginations bigger than their circumstances, together holding cameras, together making amateur films with everything they had, not because they were sure they would succeed, but because that was the only way they knew to create a world where they could exist the way they wanted. Those crude 8mm films, clumsy shots, somewhat crazy ideas, all became a parallel reality, where Bruce was no longer a boy trying to get attention, but a person with a role, a position, a meaning. There, he did not need to try hard to make people laugh to be seen, because he had already become part of the story. But right here, something deeper began to form, a feeling he might not have been able to name when he was young, which was the need for recognition, not just by friends or family, but by a larger world, a world he had only touched through his father's camera lens, and the self-made films with Raimi. The problem was, that dream did not come with a map. No one showed him where to go, what to do, who to become to truly step into that world, and therefore, Bruce Campbell's early years were not a story of a discovered talent or a predestined star, but the story of a child who learned to perform so as not to disappear, who learned to create his own world, because the real world did not guarantee it would make room for him. And perhaps, right from those days, something had quietly taken root deep inside him. That to be seen, he had to do more than others, had to try harder, had to endure more, had to accept standing in positions that others did not want to stand in. Because if not, he would return to the familiar feeling of his childhood, present but no one truly noticed. From those crude footage in the backyard and those rushed shoots with the old clunky camera, Bruce Campbell stepped into his youth with an almost naive belief that if you had enough passion and enough persistence, the world would eventually open its doors. But what he did not know at that time was that Hollywood was not a place for people who only had passion, and even less so for those who had no one standing behind them. He had no formal training, no prestigious schools, no patron, no clear roadmap to follow. Only one single thing, which was the blind trust that what he and Sam Raimi were doing would lead them to somewhere better, a place where they would no longer have to wonder whether they truly belonged or not. The small projects continued to be made, each time more ambitious, each time demanding more than what they had, and each time carried out with resources so limited it was almost unimaginable. Meager money, lacking equipment, time stretched to the point of exhaustion, but in return was the feeling that they were getting closer to the dream that no one but them believed was real. In that tiny world, Bruce was not just an actor. He was everything. The one who took the hits, the one who ran errands, the one who kept everything from falling apart, and gradually, his body began to be the first thing that had to pay the price, even though at that time he still had not realized it. He fell, he crashed, he got injured in shots where no one protected him. But instead of stopping, he laughed, stood up, and continued. Because in his mind at that time, pain was just part of the process, something temporary that would pass when success arrived. The danger did not lie in those wounds, but in the belief that all these sacrifices would surely be rewarded, that if you gave enough, you would receive something proportionate in return. And it was precisely that belief that kept him moving forward without seeing the first signs of the trade-offs that were accumulating. No one told him that there were people who would sacrifice their entire youth without ever getting back what they expected. No one warned that there were dreams that did not shatter in a single moment, but eroded you slowly, day by day, year by year, until you realized you had gone too far to turn back. The pressure began to appear, not like a big shock, but like a quiet flow, getting heavier, each project a bigger bet, each failure a small crack in the faith, but not big enough to make him stop, because stopping meant admitting that everything he had done might be meaningless. And so, Bruce Campbell continued to move forward, not because he was sure he would succeed, but because he had no other choice except to believe that this path, no matter how painful, would eventually lead to a place where he was seen, recognized, and called by name in a complete way, even though at that time he still did not know that this very path would be what made him pay more than anything he had ever imagined. And then, after all those scattered small projects, those experiments that were never big enough to change his life, Bruce Campbell, along with Sam Raimi, made a decision that would later define his entire career. A decision so reckless it was almost impossible to explain with reason. To make The Evil Dead under conditions that any professional film crew would refuse right from the first day. They had no money, no backing, no guarantee that the film would be released, let alone succeed. But they had an almost absolute belief that this was the only chance for them to step out of the loop of unfinished dreams. And if they failed, they would have nothing left to go back to. The filming took place in an isolated wooden cabin in the woods, where the cold was not just an environmental factor, but a constant challenge, seeping into every layer of clothing, penetrating the skin, making every workday a battle with their own bodies. The schedule stretched longer than expected, shooting days connected without rest. Food was scarce, living conditions were almost non-existent, and in all of that, Bruce Campbell became the one who endured the most, not because he wanted to become the center of the sacrifice, but because his role demanded it, and there was no one else who could replace him. There was no stunt double, no proper protective equipment. Every fall was real, every impact was real, every hit was real, and over time, the boundary between acting and enduring began to disappear. He was thrown against walls, dragged across the floor, splashed with freezing liquid in the middle of winter nights, and all of that was not recorded as a sacrifice, but simply became part of the film, part of the story that audiences later would watch as an entertainment experience. The injuries began to accumulate, not once but many times. Bruises that had not yet healed had to endure new impacts, pains that had no time to rest. Because every shooting day was a race against time and money, things they did not have enough of to waste. But what was scarier than the physical damage was the mental exhaustion when the whole crew began to realize they had gone too far, had invested too much to be able to stop, but also not enough to know where they would end up. There were nights Bruce lay down without knowing if the next morning he would have the strength to stand up or not. There were moments he simply wanted everything to end, not because he no longer believed in the film, but because his body could not endure anymore. And yet, every morning, he still stood up, still stepped in front of the camera, still continued, because stopping was not an option. Not when you had bet your entire youth, your health, and your future on something that no one yet knew what it would become. When the film was finally completed, it did not come with a clear feeling of victory, no fireworks, no immediate recognition, only a tired relief, as if they had just survived something that even they themselves did not fully understand. But the price had been paid, not just with time or money, but with Bruce Campbell's own body, with injuries that would not completely disappear, with pains that would return at times he did not expect, and with a truth that he only gradually realized later, that there were films that were not only made with passion, but made with blood. And once you had given to that extent, you could not take back what you had lost, even when the world finally began to look your way. From the moment The Evil Dead was finally released, Bruce Campbell did not step into a bright new world as he had once imagined, but instead stood silently in a strange emptiness, where everything seemed to have changed, but his life had not. The film gradually became a cult phenomenon, passed along by word of mouth, mentioned with excitement by film-loving audiences, praised for its boldness and difference. But all of that did not translate into what Bruce needed most at that time: stability. He did not become wealthy, did not receive big invitations from Hollywood, did not have any breakthrough that pulled him out of the fragile reality he was still living in. Instead, he returned to everyday life, where money was still a problem, where work was still uncertain, and where each passing day still carried the question of whether everything he had been through would really lead to something lasting or not. Success had arrived, but it was not big enough to save him from very real worries, and that created a painful gap between expectation and reality, a gap he could not fill with belief or simple persistence alone. Meanwhile, his personal life began to enter a new phase, when he entered his first marriage with all the hopes that this would be the support, the place where he could find the stability his career had not provided. But reality unfolded differently. When you bring instability into a relationship, it does not disappear. It spreads, seeps into every small detail of life, from financial worries, periods of separation because of work, to unmet expectations. And gradually, the pressure began to accumulate, not loudly, not explosively, but quietly stretching everything away from its original position. Bruce continued to work, continued to look for opportunities, continued to believe that just one more step, one more project, everything would change. But each time like that, the result was not enough to create real difference. And that very thing made the feeling of disappointment become deeper, because it was not a clear failure that could be accepted and started over, but a halfway state, where you had gone far enough not to be able to turn back, but not far enough to achieve what you wanted. His career at this time was like a road with no signs, where every choice carried risk, and every step forward did not guarantee where it would lead, while personal life demanded more specific, more stable things, things he could not yet provide. There were nights he had to ask himself whether he was pursuing an unrealistic dream or not, whether all those sacrifices, those injuries, those years that had passed were really worth it, or just a series of decisions he no longer had the courage to abandon. But even in those moments of doubt, he still continued, not because he was sure he would succeed, but because he did not know any other way to live except to keep walking on this path. And that was the biggest paradox of this period, that success had come, but it did not solve any of the problems he was facing. It did not bring safety. It did not bring safety. It did not bring certainty. It did not bring answers to the bigger questions about his life, but simply placed him in a position where he had to keep fighting, not to achieve success, but to prove that the initial success was not all he would have. And then, while Bruce Campbell was still trying to keep his life and career from slipping out of control, something that seemed like his biggest opportunity gradually became his biggest limitation when the character Ash Williams, the face that had brought him to audiences, did not just stay on screen but clung tightly to him in every aspect of his career. With Evil Dead 2, the image of Ash was pushed further, crazier, bolder, and audiences began to love the mix of horror and humor that Bruce portrayed. They laughed, they remembered every line. They saw him as an irreplaceable icon, and when Army of Darkness came out, that was almost completely cemented. Ash was no longer just a role, but became part of popular culture, an image that anyone who had seen it could recognize immediately. But right at the moment when many people thought Bruce had truly arrived, a different reality began to emerge, a reality he could not control, when Hollywood began to see him not as an actor with diverse abilities, but as a single character repeated over and over, a mold that had already been shaped, and anything outside that mold became unnecessary in the eyes of those who made the decisions. Other opportunities did not disappear suddenly. They simply did not appear. There were no official rejections, no clear failures, only prolonged silence. Phone calls that never came, auditions that did not happen. And over time, Bruce began to realize that his success had created a shadow too big, a shadow he could not step out of, no matter how hard he tried. He continued to work, continued to take new roles when he could, but each time like that, he felt more clearly the limitation he was facing. When both audiences and the industry expected him to become the familiar version of himself, nothing more, nothing less, as if everything he could do had already been defined many years before. This did not come as a shock, but as a gradual realization, a feeling that grew clearer that the road ahead of him did not expand, but narrowed little by little. Each passing year was one more time he saw more clearly the boundaries he could not cross. And the most painful thing was not being rejected, but never having the chance to prove that he could do more than that behind Ash Williams was another person, another actor, another ability that no one really wanted to explore. Bruce Campbell became a living paradox, a person who was loved but limited, A person with a strong imprint but unable to expand it, and deep down, he had to face a question that no one else could answer for him, whether being remembered forever with one role was a victory or just another form of imprisonment. There were moments he stood in front of the mirror, looking at himself and wondering who he would be without Ash. But then, that question never had a clear answer, because the world around him had never really given him the chance to find out. And so, he continued to walk, carrying the shadow of himself, not because he chose it, but because that was the only thing the world was willing to see in him, a role that had given him everything, and at the same time had taken away from him the things he had never had the chance to achieve. And then, after the shadow of Ash Williams covered every corner of Bruce Campbell's career, the following years did not come as a loud collapse, but as a prolonged period of fading, where he still worked, still appeared, but gradually was no longer the name mentioned in the big conversations of the industry. He took small roles, television projects that few people noticed, films without strong promotional campaigns, and each time like that, he stepped onto the set with the same spirit as before. But the result did not change. There was no clear progress, no breakthrough that pulled him out of the position where he had been framed. The media did not speak badly of him, but it also did not speak about him. And in a world where attention was value, that silence gradually became a form of disappearance, not disappearing completely, but disappearing from the important places, from the opportunities that could change a life. Meanwhile, his personal life began to reflect more clearly the pressures that an unstable career brought when his first marriage, which had been built with the hope of bringing balance, gradually cracked under the weight of prolonged worries, periods of separation, unmet expectations, and the feeling that everything was drifting without any solid support. There was no single moment marking the end, no big event that made everything collapse immediately, but a process of accumulation, where each passing day carried a bit more fatigue, a bit more disappointment, until everything could no longer hold its original shape. Bruce continued to work, continued to take roles, continued to appear where he was needed. But inside, a question began to become clearer than ever, whether all these efforts would lead to anything different or not, or just an endless loop with no ending. Those years were not recorded in big headlines, not mentioned as a memorable period, but right in that quietness, the feeling of being forgotten began to form, not because he no longer existed, but because he was no longer seen in the way he had once hoped. There were days he stepped onto the set and realized that no one there really knew or cared about the journey he had been through, that for them he was just another actor, a name on the list, a person who could complete the job but did not carry the weight of a story, and that, over time, became harder to accept than any rejection, because at least when rejected, you knew you had been seen, while when overlooked, you began to wonder whether you had ever really existed in other people's eyes or not. His personal life and career continued to intertwine in a way that could not be separated. When difficulties at work affected his mood, the way he saw himself, and vice versa, personal pressures made every step in his career heavier. And even though he still kept his humorous appearance, still made others laugh, still played the role that audiences were familiar with, inside, a deep fatigue was gradually accumulating, not from a big event, but from hundreds, thousands of small moments that no one else saw. Those were the years not remembered, not because they were not important, but because they were not dramatic enough to become a story. But right in that calm, Bruce Campbell had to face one of the hardest challenges of his life, continuing to walk when there was no clear sign that the road would lead anywhere, and holding on to faith in himself, while the world around seemed to have shifted its attention elsewhere. After those years that passed in near silence that almost no one noticed, Bruce Campbell gradually realized a truth harder to accept than any clear failure. He was not kicked out of Hollywood. He simply no longer belonged to it anymore. The film industry began to change at a faster pace than ever before. Big-budget blockbusters, a tightly built star system, younger, fresher faces more suited to mainstream tastes, all created a current that Bruce could not step into. not because he lacked talent, but because he no longer fit the way Hollywood wanted to tell stories. Big action roles demanded a different image. Commercial films needed names that could guarantee box office revenue, while artistic projects sought faces with a completely different color. And in the middle of all that, Bruce Campbell became a blank space, a person who did not belong to any category that the industry could easily use. There was no scandal to make him noticed in a negative way, but there were also no big victories to pull him back to the center. His career existed in a gray area that few people really cared about. The label movie actor began to cling tightly to him. At first as a description, then becoming a definition, and finally turning into an invisible limit he could not cross, no matter how hard he tried. Each time he appeared in a new project, he carried that label with him, and before the audience even had a chance to see the character he was portraying, they already knew who they were looking at. And that made every effort to change meaningless right from the starting point. The pain did not lie in being labeled, but in having no opportunity to escape it, when every door leading to different roles closed before he could even step toward them. The gap between his real ability and the opportunities he received became increasingly clear, not because he suddenly became worse, but because the world around him had changed without taking him along. People who had started at the same time as him gradually found their places in the system, becoming familiar names on big movie posters, while Bruce remained right there, continuing to work, continuing to exist, but never stepping into the circle he once thought he would belong to. There were moments he looked back at his journey and realized that he had gone far enough to be remembered, but had never gone far enough to be recognized in the way Hollywood defined success. And that difference, though small in wording, created a very large gap in the way he was perceived. No one said he had failed, but no one said he had succeeded by the industry's standards either. And so he was stuck between two worlds, not fully belonging to either. In an industry where presence was measured by lights and attention, standing outside the main current was not an easy choice, but a state you had to learn to accept if you did not want to be crushed by the things you could not change. Bruce Campbell never stopped working, never stopped appearing, never stopped keeping his name alive in a space that few people noticed, and that very persistence became the only way for him not to disappear completely. But with time, he understood there was a truth he could not avoid, that no matter how hard he tried, there were positions in this industry that would forever not be for him, not because he did not deserve them, but because he did not fit the way the system was built. And in that gradual acceptance, there was a sadness very hard to name. Not the sadness of failure, but the sadness of standing right next to his dream, close enough to see it, but never being allowed to step inside. In a period when all the big doors seemed to have closed, Bruce Campbell no longer tried to break them the way he had done in the early years. Instead, he began to do something else, something less noisy but no less difficult, learning to live with reality as the person he was, not by becoming a different version to fit Hollywood, but by accepting what he had been through and turning it into something others could understand, could feel, and even could laugh along with. Humor, which had once been a way for him to get noticed when he was young, now became a tool for him to face the things he could not change, a protective layer that helped him talk about failures, limitations, years of being overlooked without making them too heavy, but also without losing the truth behind them. He began to tell his story in a way few people in his industry did, not as a journey of victory, but as a series of real experiences, sometimes clumsy, sometimes painful, but always with a rare honesty. The book, If Chins Could Kill, was not just a memoir, but a way for him to put his entire journey into a context he could control, where he was no longer the person defined by others, but the person telling his own story with all the details Hollywood had never cared about. Those written pages did not hide the truth, that he had struggled, that he had been framed, that he had not achieved the things many of his contemporaries had gotten, but they also showed something else, that he was still here, still existed, and still had his own voice. On television, his image gradually changed, not into a bigger star, but into someone more approachable, someone willing to mock himself, willing to tell stories that others might be hesitant to mention, and that very thing made audiences begin to see him in a different way. Not just as Ash Williams, but as a real human being with real experiences. He appeared on shows, joined interviews, interacted with fans, and each time like that, he did not try to hide what he had been through, but turned it into part of the image he built. An image that was not perfect but authentic, not glamorous but accessible. What was notable was that he did not turn those failures into sadness for others to pity, but turned them into stories for others to laugh at, not to mock but to laugh along with, as a way to share the burden he had carried for so many years. Gradually, Bruce Campbell created his own space in the industry, a place that did not depend on whether he was chosen for big projects or not, did not depend on whether the media mentioned him or not, but relied on the direct connection between him and the audience, those who had followed him from the early days and still remained. It was not the path he had imagined when he started, not the position he thought he would reach, but a way of existing that he could control, a way to ensure he did not disappear completely in an industry that was always changing. Some people achieved success by climbing to higher positions. Bruce Campbell chose to stand firm where he was, not because he did not want to go further, but because he understood that there were battles that could not be won by chasing the system, but by creating a different path, a path where he did not need to become anyone other than himself. And in that choice, there was a quiet calm, not surrender, but a form of adaptation, a way to keep moving forward without losing himself, even when that path did not lead to the bright lights he had once dreamed of. That adaptation eventually led Bruce Campbell back to the thing that had shaped his entire life, when he once again put on the image of Ash Williams in Ash vs. Evil Dead, a return that many fans had waited for over decades. An opportunity that seemed like it could rewrite the unfinished story, taking him from the familiar position to a new, brighter chapter. Right from when the series premiered, the reaction from loyal audiences was undeniable. They welcomed him as if no time gap had ever existed. They laughed, they cheered, they repeated old lines with the same excitement as before, and in those moments, it was easy to believe that Bruce Campbell had finally found the position he deserved. The fan interactions, the events, the responses filled with affection made everything seem different, as if all the forgotten years had been compensated by a belated recognition. But the deeper into reality it went, something else began to emerge, something he was probably more familiar with than anyone, that this return, no matter how warm it was, still did not change the nature of the position he held in the industry. The success of the series still stayed within the scope it had always belonged to, a cult space where the audience who loved him had always existed. But it did not expand beyond that limit, did not bring him closer to the opportunities he had once sought, did not change the way Hollywood perceived him. The image of Ash Williams continued to be reinforced, continued to be repeated, continued to become what audiences expected, and each time like that, the gap between his real self and that image became clearer. Because even though he could bring joy, bring laughter, bring familiarity, he was still replaying a part of the past, rather than stepping into a new future. There was no big transformation, no breakthrough role appeared afterward. No door opened just because he had proven he could still do it, and this was not a shock, but a continuation of what had been happening for many years. A confirmation that no matter how strongly he returned, the system still did not change the way it saw him. Bruce Campbell stood at the center of a very real affection, but also stood outside what was considered success by general standards, a position both close and distant, where he was welcomed but not elevated, remembered but not brought into bigger games. There were moments he stepped onto the stage, looked down at the familiar faces in the crowd, and felt everything he had achieved, but at the same time realized that there were things that would never change, not because he had not done enough, but because his story had been defined long before that. This return was not a turning point, but a loop. A return to the starting point with more experience, more years, but with the same limitation he had carried from before. And in all of that, there was a sadness very hard to describe. Not the sadness of failure, but the sadness of knowing that you had done what others expected, but still could not become what you had once hoped for. A quiet but persistent feeling that followed you with every step, reminding you that there were doors that did not close loudly, but simply never opened, no matter how many times you came back to knock. Those loops did not only exist on screen or in the way the industry perceived him, but also imprinted themselves on Bruce Campbell's own body and life in a way that very few people truly knew about, because what audiences always saw was the smile, the confidence, a man who seemed never to be defeated, while what he carried after leaving the lights was a different story. A story with no audience, no applause, and no recognition either. The injuries from the shooting days of The Evil Dead and its sequels did not disappear when the cameras stopped rolling. They stayed, quietly, persistently, becoming part of his body over the years. Pains not big enough to make him stop, but not small enough for him to forget, appearing at times he did not expect, reminding him that every fall, every impact, every day of endurance in the past had a price he had to keep paying. There were mornings he woke up with the feeling that his body no longer responded as before. Movements that used to be easy now became heavier, pains appearing without clear reason, as if time was gradually taking back what he had borrowed from his youth. But what tired him more than anything was not just the physical, but the prolonged mental pressure. A pressure that did not come from a specific event, but from a feeling accumulated over many years that he had given so much, had sacrificed not a little, but what he received back was never proportionate to what he once believed he could achieve. That feeling did not explode, did not make him collapse immediately, but existed like a background in his thoughts, following him through every project, every role, every appearance, making even small successes carry a bit of emptiness, because it always came with the question of whether this was all or not. His life behind the camera was not lavish parties or moments captured on the front pages, but ordinary days, consecutive jobs, efforts to keep his career from being interrupted. And in all of that, there was a very particular loneliness, not loneliness because there was no one around, but loneliness in carrying a story that not many people truly understood. Those difficulties were rarely spoken about, not because they did not exist, but because he had grown used to keeping them to himself, used to turning them into lighter stories when standing in front of audiences, used to letting others see the version they wanted to see, instead of the tired version he had to face when no one was looking. There were times he had to remind himself that still standing here, still working, still being remembered, was already something valuable, but that did not completely erase the feeling that some part of his journey had never been properly recognized. And it was precisely the silence surrounding those injuries that made them heavier, because when not named, they did not disappear. They only existed in a quieter, deeper, and harder to share way. Bruce Campbell continued to move forward with all of that, not because he did not feel tired, but because he had grown used to carrying it, used to turning what no one talked about into part of who he was. A part that audiences might never see, but always present in every step, every role. Every time he stood in front of the lights and smiled as if everything was fine, even though deep inside he knew that the price of this journey had never truly been fully paid. After everything that had accumulated, the lingering injuries, the years of being overlooked, the questions without clear answers, Bruce Campbell gradually shifted away from the orbit he once pursued, not through a loud decision, but through a series of small, quiet choices that brought him closer to a form of peace he had never thought he needed before. His marriage to Ida Guerin became a different kind of support, not because it brought glamour or attention, but because it gave him a space not defined by work, where he did not need to prove anything, where he could exist as an ordinary person after many years of living in a world that always demanded more. Ida understood the industry he was in, understood the pressures he carried, and that very understanding helped them build a life not based on unrealistic expectations, but on simpler, more sustainable things. Bruce began to keep his private life separate from the spotlight, not because he had anything to hide, but because he realized that not every part of life needed to be seen to have value. Evenings without cameras, family moments not recorded, days passing without headlines, all gradually became an important part of the way he redefined his life. Like a balance for the years when everything seemed always out of control, he no longer pursued recognition at all costs, no longer waited for a big opportunity that would change everything, no longer placed his self-worth in whether he was chosen or not, but shifted to focusing on what he could control, the work he wanted to do, the relationships he wanted to keep, and the limits he was willing to accept. That did not come as surrender, but as an adjustment, a way to keep moving forward without carrying the same pressure as before. His life did not become perfect. Not every problem disappeared, but a stability began to form, a new rhythm he could keep up with, where each day was no longer a battle to prove something, but an opportunity to exist in a way that felt right to him. There were mornings he woke up without the feeling of having to race against time. There were days that passed when he did not wonder whether he had done enough or not, and in those moments, he began to understand that the things he had searched for over many years did not lie ahead, but in stopping long enough to realize what he already had. That peace was not loud, not announced, not turned into a story others told, but for Bruce Campbell it carried a meaning that no role could replace. Because for the first time in a long time, he no longer had to fight to hold his place in a world that was always changing, but could stand still and feel that he had found a place he did not need to leave. The peace that Bruce Campbell found was not an ending point, but a foundation for a deeper change. When he began to look back at his entire journey with a different perspective, no longer dominated by old expectations, no longer pulled by standards he once thought he had to meet, but a clear acknowledgement of his position in the entertainment industry. He understood that there were limits not created by him, but things he had to live with, that Hollywood was not always a fair system, and not reaching a certain position did not mean he had failed, but simply that he did not fit the mold that system prioritized. In the past, there were times he tried to change the way others saw him, seeking different roles, different opportunities to prove he could do more. But over time, he realized that trying to change a prejudice that had sunk deep into this industry did not always bring results, and sometimes it only made him drift further from his true self. That acceptance did not come immediately, but was the result of many years facing reality, many times hoping, then being disappointed, many times wondering, then not finding answers, until he realized there was another way to exist without having to keep fighting in the same way as before. Bruce Campbell began to focus on what he could control, the projects he truly wanted to join, the stories he wanted to tell, the relationships he wanted to keep, instead of chasing opportunities he could not decide. His attitude toward life became more realistic, clearer, no longer swept up in illusions of a big turning point that would change everything, but an understanding that life did not always unfold the way you imagined, and what mattered was not how much you achieved, but what you kept after everything you had been through. The way he saw himself also changed. From a person always trying to prove his worth to a person who understood that worth did not need to be validated by others to exist. He no longer compared himself to his contemporaries, no longer asked why others had things he did not have, but focused on how far he had come from his starting point, from a boy making amateur films to a name that millions of people still remembered. There was a lightness in the way he talked about the past, not because it no longer hurt, but because he no longer resisted it. He accepted that what had happened was part of the journey and did not need to be changed to have meaning. In that acceptance, Bruce Campbell did not become smaller, but became clearer, not as a star defined by Hollywood, but as a human being who had gone through enough to understand that not every life needed to reach the peak to be memorable, and sometimes, standing firm in your own position, with everything it carried, was already a form of success that not everyone could achieve. From that acceptance, Bruce Campbell did not disappear from the story of cinema, but quietly shifted to a different form of presence, a form that did not need to stand under the brightest lights to be seen, where his influence did not lie in box office numbers or prestigious awards, but in the way he persisted in the memory of audiences, especially those who had followed him from the very first days. In the cult fan community, the name Bruce Campbell was not just an actor, but an icon, a part of the experience they had been attached to for many years, from The Evil Dead to his later appearances. Each role of his carried a very distinct mark, not perfect by traditional standards, but special enough to be irreplaceable. His lines, his expressions, those seemingly small moments became the things audiences remembered longer than any grand shot, because there was something real in them, something not created to please the masses, but simply reflecting who he was. He did not need big titles to make an imprint, did not need awards to prove his value, because the recognition he received came from a different place, from viewers who had chosen to stay with him through time, people who did not need Hollywood to say he was important before believing he mattered. This created a different relationship, not between a star and an audience, but between a human being and those who had witnessed his journey, understood what he had been through, and therefore appreciated him in the deeper way. In an industry where the path to success was often clearly laid out, Bruce Campbell went in a different direction, not because he did not want to go with the main current, but because he was not allowed, and that very thing forced him to create his own path, a way of existing that did not depend on being chosen or not, but on whether he could continue doing what he wanted within the scope he had. That path was not easy, did not bring clear rewards, but over time it created something not everyone could build. A legacy not tied to a single moment, but to an entire long process, where every step, every choice, every time continuing despite no guarantee, contributed to shaping who he was. Bruce Campbell's legacy did not lie in greatest lists, was not engraved in the rankings the industry honored, but it existed in a different place, where people who truly cared about his story could find it, where persistence, endurance, and the ability not to disappear became the core values. And perhaps right in that shadow, where not too much light shone on it, he had built something far more lasting than what the spotlight could bring, something that did not depend on how many times it was seen, but on the fact that he was still there, still continued, still himself. Through each passing year, in the shadow where Bruce Campbell's legacy was formed, when the lights were no longer too bright and the applause no longer echoed like what Hollywood reserved for big stars, his story appeared clearer than ever, not as a familiar victory journey, but as a long flow of efforts, sacrifices, and things that had never been spoken about completely. Looking back from the early days in Michigan, from a boy finding ways to make others notice him through humor, to the years making amateur films with Sam Raimi, then stepping into the harsh challenge of The Evil Dead, where he bet not only his time but his own body. All of that did not lead him to a straight path, as many once thought, but opened a more complex journey, where success and limitation existed side by side, where every step forward came with a price that was not always seen. Bruce Campbell's life did not follow the path Hollywood usually drew for those considered successful. He did not become the face topping the box office, did not receive big awards, did not have moments where the whole world stopped to call his name as an icon in the traditional sense. But that did not mean he had failed. It only meant he had lived a life outside the mold others were familiar with. In that journey, there were things he had lost, opportunities that never came back, a first marriage that fell apart, years of being overlooked, roles that never arrived, dreams that did not fully come true, and moments he had to ask himself whether he had been on the right path or not. But alongside those losses were the things that remained: an identity that did not dissolve, a deep connection with audiences, an ability to keep working in an industry that was not easy to hold on to anyone, and an understanding of himself that not everyone could achieve. Bruce Campbell did not just exist through one period, but through many different periods of cinema. From the years making independent films to the television era, from the time he was noticed to the time he was forgotten and then remembered in a different way, and in all those changes, he still kept something very rare, which was the ability not to disappear. He might not stand at the center of the light, but he had never left the stage completely. He was still there, continuing to appear, continuing to tell his story in his own way, continuing to exist in a space not everyone saw but still always present. The value of that journey did not lie in how much he had achieved, but in the fact that he had not given up, had not let limitations define his entire being, had found a way to keep moving forward, even when the path did not lead to where he once imagined. And perhaps that was the hardest truth to accept, but also the most worthy of respect: that not every life ended with a brilliant victory. Not every journey had a clear peak, but that did not make them less meaningful. Because sometimes, still being here, still standing firm, still continuing even with nothing guaranteed ahead, was already a form of victory that only those who truly understood their own journey could feel. Bruce Campbell's story leaves a very particular bittersweet feeling. Not because he failed in the usual way, but because he did almost everything right, sacrificing his body during the filming of The Evil Dead, accepting pain, enduring years of financial instability, and continuing to work while opportunities grew narrower but still never stood in the position many believed he deserved. What makes this story heartbreaking is not the big events, but the chain of quiet losses: a first marriage that broke under career pressure, long years labeled a B-movie actor, comebacks like Ash vs. Evil Dead that were loved but still did not change his position in the industry, and the physical injuries carried from his youth all the way into old age. However, right in those things emerged a very human kind of greatness. He did not quit, did not disappear, did not lose his identity, even though the system did not give him the commensurate reward. For American audiences, a society that often measures success by fame, money, and position, this story is a profound reminder that a person's value does not lie in where they stand in the spotlight, but in how firmly they stood when the light no longer shone on them. Bruce Campbell shows that there are lives not honored with brilliant glory, but still worthy of respect for their persistence, self-respect, and ability to keep moving forward when nothing is guaranteed ahead. And that is the most practical lesson. In a world that is not always fair, not disappearing is sometimes the greatest victory. If the story of a man who was never placed at the center of the light but still never disappeared makes you think, please hit subscribe and leave a heart as a sign of respect for that journey. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video where we continue to explore imperfect lives that have never given up.